In the last section, we successfully issued an AJAX request for a weather forecast. We did that by hooking up our search bar here to the fetch weather action creator. And remember, we got access to that action creator by connecting our component through map dispatch to props with search bar. All right, so in this section, we're going to work a little bit more on figuring out exactly what's going on with the package that we installed earlier, Redux Promise. We're also going to make sure that we can at least have an idea of how we're going to work with the data that's coming back. So to get started on this, we're going to go ahead and create a new reducer for handling the fetch weather action. I'm going to create a new file called reducer.weather.js inside of the reducers folder. And inside of here, we're going to export default. Remember, reducers are just functions. The first argument is always our state for this particular piece of state that the reducer is responsible for. We'll default it to null. And then the second argument is always our action. Now, in here, I'm just going to go ahead and console log action received action. So we're just going to console log the action. We're also going to return the state, like so. Then we need to make sure that this reducer is actually being made use of by adding it to our combined reducers call inside of reducers index.js. So inside of here, we'll import the reducer. Reducer weather. And this will be responsible for the weather part of our state, like so. Okay, so back over inside of our reducer here, let's take a second to review where we are. We've got a simple reducer here that just takes an action, it console logs it, and it doesn't really do anything with the state, so we can pretty much just ignore this return state call for right now. All we really need to be concerned about is this console log. Next, we're going to flip over to our action creator. And in here, I want to do something as well. I just want to console log the request that goes out as well. So we're going to say request is request. So remember what happens in our application here. A user enters a search term. They submit the form that calls the action creator, fetch weather, and passes in the city. We then craft a URL with the city and make an AJAX request with Axios. And Axios returns a promise here. Just as the documentation that we looked at very briefly said, it's a promise. That's all it is. It returns a promise. Now, a promise is a data structure that doesn't actually yet contain any of our request data, right? If you're not familiar with promises, don't sweat it. Just take my word for it. The promise doesn't actually the promise doesn't actually contain any of our data. But I want you to take note here that we are returning the request, the promise, on the payload key here. Okay, very important right here. We're returning the promise as the payload. All right, so with that in mind, let's do a little experiment. We got two console logs in here, one inside of the reducer and one inside of the action creator. Inside the action creator, we are console logging the request and then attaching it to the payload. And then inside of the reducer, we're console logging the entire action, which should have that same exact payload, right? Same payload. So I'm going to refresh the page. And you'll notice that right away we get 3 console logs here. And they're all action receives. And they have type of Redux init, Redux probe unknown action. These are some default actions that Redux always dispatches whenever it first starts up. So it's just some like boot up actions just to assemble some initial state for our application and make sure that all of our reducers make sense and don't return undefined, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'm going to do something here. I'm going to search for San Francisco. And I want you to watch the console log here very closely. So I'm going to search. And you'll see that I get 2 additional console logs here. I get one that is the request. So that's definitely coming from the reducer, from the action creator, because that's where we said console log request. And then we've also got action received, which is definitely coming from the reducer. If we look at the request here, we see that we're console logging a promise. It's definitely a promise. It says promise. Promise, 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 all the way through here, right? Promise. You can take my word for it, it's a promise. If you recall, as I just said 6 times in a row probably, we take this promise, we assign it to the payload key, and then that goes off to our reducers. So this is that same action right here. Here's the payload. This object right here should be the promise. So let's check it out. We'll expand that, and then we'll expand the payload, and well, wait a minute. We've got a status of 200, a status text of OK, and we've got some data here. And looking at the data, make this a little bit bigger, too big. Looking at the data, this is our actual request response right here. So what the heck just happened? Just to make sure it's really clear why this is weird, we've got our action creator, we've got a request, it's a promise, we return it as the payload. The action is supposed to go straight over to the reducers. Here's that same action, we console log it, but now, instead of being a promise on the payload, we have the response there instead. So what's happening here? Well, as you might imagine, maybe I've led up to this way too much, but as you might imagine, this is the purpose of Redux Promise. This is exactly what Redux Promise does. Remember, Redux Promise is a middleware. Middlewares have the ability to stop or manipulate actions before they hit any reducer whatsoever. So what's happening is Redux Promise sees this incoming action. It's the gatekeeper. It sees the action. It looks at specifically the payload property. The payload property right here. If the payload is a promise, Redux Promise stops the action entirely. It says, hey, here's an action. It's got a payload of a promise. I care about this. This is something that, this is my thing. It's my jam. This is what I do. It stops the action entirely. And then once the request finishes, it dispatches a new action of the same type, but with a payload of the resolved request. So in other words, it unwraps the promise for us. It says, okay, this is a promise. The reducers don't really care about just getting a promise. They really care about the data. So it stops the action. It waits until the promise resolves. And then it says, okay, I've got the resolved data. Here's the request from the server. I'm going to now send that to the reducer as the payload. Okay, so this is really where middleware starts to get really, really fantastic by doing this kind of, interstitial handling of actions for us. If you imagine for a second, what would we do if we ended up inside of our reducer with a promise? That would be kind of hard to work with. We would have to say like, okay, well, here's our switch statement, but don't run the switch statement until this action gets resolved. That would be kind of a pain in the rear. So what we do is we use this middleware that stops the promise and it stops the action in its tracks until the promise is resolved, and then it goes off and does its thing. To help nail the point home, just one more time here. Let's run through it one more time. I've got a diagram in here. Probably should have opened it sooner, but such is the way. So here is essentially the flow through our application of this promise, of this action, excuse me. First, we've got our action that returns from the action creator. It enters our middleware. It enters, specifically the Redux Promise middleware. Redux Promise says, does the action have a promise as a payload? If it doesn't, then okay, this isn't, it's not my job, I don't care for it. Just let it go through, let it go and hit the reducers. If the action does have a promise as the payload though, it does, yes, stop the action, just stop it entirely, and only after the promise resolves, after the AJAX request is finished, create a new action and then send it through to the reducers, where the reducers can say like, oh sweet, just normal data, not a promise, normal data, I know how to handle this. Okay, so this is why, again, middleware is so fantastic. It allows us to make this really fantastic step in here that dramatically simplifies our application. The code that we've written, this AJAX request is asynchronous in nature. It doesn't happen instantly. Normally we have to pass a callback to it, or we have to deal with a promise or something like that. But the code that we've written in here, it really doesn't appear that we've got any asynchronous code in here. It all looks like it's 100% synchronous. And what that allows us to do is to have some really nice looking code that is not overly complex. That's the point of Redux Promise, to clean up our code. All right, so with this very thorough explanation through, I'm going to remove our 2 console logs in here. So out of the action creator and out of our reducer. And let's go ahead and continue inside the next section where we're going to finish up our weather reducer.